What does silence sound like when it swallows 12 voices at once? Some say it is the loudest sound ever heard on that Tennessee night in 1862, a silence so heavy it pressed upon the lungs of every man, woman, and child left behind. A silence not of peace, but of judgment, the kind that comes after thunder, after the axe falls, after breath itself is stolen away. The story begins in the slave quarters, where whispers lived longer than laughter and where the walls themselves seemed to listen. For decades, the enslaved bent their backs beneath the whips and commands of men who believed themselves unbreakable. 12 of those men, masters, overseers, and kin, would learn that power is not eternal. It is fragile, and when pressed too far, it can be swallowed whole by the very silence it once mocked. Legends say the moon that night was swollen and red, though others insist it hid behind clouds, ashamed to look. The fields lay damp with summer sweat, cicadas rasping like restless spirits, and dogs in the distance howled to things unseen. Inside the quarters, children hushed themselves without being told. Elders closed their eyes and rocked in rhythm, as if hearing a hymn too low for mortal ears. A night was coming, the kind sung about not with voices but with fear. And then when the dark grew deepest, the silence descended. 12 voices, men who had shouted, cursed, and commanded, were smothered at once. Their cries did not echo. Their bodies left no trace. When dawn broke, the big house stood hollow, its doors yawning open like a mouth robbed of teeth. All that remained was the legend of absence, a void more powerful than fire or blood. Revenge, they say, is a storm. It can rise like floodwaters, burn like wildfire, strike like lightning. But in Tennessee, in the year of war and reckoning, revenge came dressed as silence, patient, merciless, and eternal. And that silence, once tasted, never truly left. For if you stand by the ruins even now, some claim you can still hear it, a hollow breath, waiting to swallow again. The summer of 1862 pressed down on Tennessee like a wet cloth smothering a fire. The Civil War raged in distant fields, battles sung of in newspapers and whispered of in roadside taverns. But here, on this plantation tucked among the rolling hills and slow rivers, little had changed. The overseer's horn still blew at first light, and the bells dragged weary bodies from restless sleep. Chains clinked against the dirt paths as men, women, and children stumbled toward the fields, their breaths rising like steam in the heavy dawn. Cotton stretched across the land, row upon row, endless as punishment itself. Overseers barked commands, their whips cracking sharp as thunder over bent backs. Sweat slicked the air before the sun had even risen high, and the fields shimmered like a mirage of toil and despair. The rhythm was unbroken. Pick, carry, bend, bleed. Day after day, the war felt far away, and here the old order clung like mold to rotting wood. The slave quarters crouched at the edge of the fields, a cluster of wooden cabins nailed together from scraps. Smoke leaked through cracked roofs, the smell of boiled roots and bitter corn clinging to the walls. Inside, space was tight, families crowded into corners, their whispers carrying prayers, songs, and stories meant to soothe children who had never known freedom. Shadows seemed thicker there, not just from the lack of light, but from the weight of secrets carried silently between generations. Beyond the cabins, the master's house loomed. Once whitewashed and proud, its boards now sagged, the paint peeling under the southern sun. A veranda creaked where drunken laughter spilled on humid nights, yet the grandeur rang hollow. Inside, portraits of ancestors stared down with fading eyes, the pride of their line eaten away by termites and time. And yet between these two worlds, the crumbling grand house and the crowded quarters, lay a tension like a taut rope. The masters still clung to their illusion of power, while in the cabins, resilience grew quietly like weeds in the cracks of stone. The air itself seemed to know. The order of things could not hold forever. The humidity carried not just heat but dread, thick, suffocating, and waiting to break. Among the bent backs in the fields and the hushed shadows of the cabins, there was one who drew no attention. Their name was spoken rarely, and even then only in whispers. To the overseers, they were nothing more than another pair of calloused hands, another bowed head beneath the sun. They worked without complaint, eyes fixed low, voice seldom raised above a murmur. If ordered to lift, they lifted. If told to mend, they mended. A life shaped into obedience, or so it seemed. Yet beneath that quiet exterior lived something else. A silence sharper than any blade, coiled like a snake in tall grass. Years of grief smoldered within, losses stacked like stones on their back. But unlike others whose pain spilled in tears or rebellion cut short, this one carried it differently. They hid it, nurtured it, fed it like a hidden ember, glowing unseen until the right breath of wind might ignite it into fire. Their place on the plantation seemed unremarkable, almost invisible. They tended livestock in the early dawn, feeding pigs and gathering eggs before the fields swallowed the rest. At times, they were called to repair barns, replace hinges, patch holes in fences. Such work placed them near tools others rarely touched: hammers, nails, ropes, oil. Overseers paid little mind, for they trusted their silence. To them, this figure was harmless, a creature too beaten down to lift its gaze, much less lift a hand in defiance. But silence is a mask, and in the stillness of their labor, the protagonist learned the rhythms of the plantation better than any master. They knew when the overseers drank themselves into stupors, when the dogs slept deepest, when the keys to the grain storehouse hung forgotten by the door. Every routine became a map, every order a revelation. No one suspected. Not the masters with their arrogant laughter, not the weary fellow slaves who mistook silence for surrender. Yet within that quiet form beat a heart that remembered every lash, every loss, every name stolen by chains. And while others prayed for deliverance, this one sharpened silence itself into a weapon, waiting, patient, unseen. It began with small things, so small the masters hardly noticed. A hammer left where it should not be. A lock that stuck one morning though it had turned easily the night before. Buckets tipped in the barn, ropes tangled without reason. Overseers barked at the slaves, blaming clumsiness, laziness, or spite. Yet in the cabins, when the doors closed and the firelight burned low, glances passed between the weary like signals in the dark. They knew these were not accidents. Something was moving beneath the surface, as steady and silent as roots pushing through stone. The animals felt it first. Horses snorted and kicked against their stalls, eyes rolling white at shadows only they seemed to see. Dogs, once eager to chase the enslaved, began whimpering at night, refusing to cross the dirt paths toward the quarters. Chickens startled and flapped for no cause, leaving feathers scattered like omens. The plantation's rhythm faltered, its certainty shaken by things that could not be named. Meanwhile, the protagonist worked as they always had, back bent, lips pressed tight. But their hands moved with purpose. Nails collected from broken planks were hidden under loose boards in the livestock shed. Frayed rope ends were gathered, knotted, and tucked away where no overseer thought to look. Bits of rusted metal, discarded by careless hands, were sharpened quietly on stone, their edges tested in secret. Each day's labor offered opportunity, each tool a piece of something larger forming in the dark. The masters were too distracted to notice. The war that raged across Tennessee filled their evenings with gossip and drink. News came by riders and newspapers, Union troops pushing south, Confederate soldiers begging for food and supplies. Some masters boasted that victory was certain. Others fretted over rumors of raids and uprisings in nearby counties. But all of them, drunk on arrogance and whiskey, dismissed the shifting air beneath their own roofs. The enslaved felt it keenly. Their songs at dusk grew lower, their prayers sharper, their silences longer. Even children seemed to understand, sitting still when dogs howled, eyes wide as if waiting for a signal only they could hear. Something was coming, and though no one spoke it aloud, the weight of it pressed on every chest. The plantation was no longer steady ground. It had become a coil pulled tighter with every passing night, waiting for the strike. And in that silence, the storm gathered strength, unseen but unstoppable. The first overseer fell in the fields. One moment he was shouting, whip slicing the air, and the next his knees buckled. He gasped like a fish pulled from water, clutching at his chest before collapsing into the dust. The cotton rows fell silent. Slaves froze, their hands still gripping bowls, waiting for the next command that never came. By sundown, he was dead. The masters muttered of heat stroke, but the whispers in the quarters told a different tale. Something had begun. Days later, another overseer's horse reared without warning, its eyes rolling wild. It bolted, dragging him half a mile through the fields before throwing him against a fence post. His body broke like dry wood. Children in the cabins whispered that the animals saw what men could not, that the air itself had turned against their oppressors. Fear trickled first as rumor, then as conviction. The women of the big house claimed their food tasted bitter, that the bread carried an odd tang, the stew a strange heaviness. At night, white children woke shrieking, insisting that figures stood at their windows, tall shadows with eyes glowing like embers. When the shutters were flung open, nothing stirred but the trees. Still, the terror clung. The masters searched for answers in fury. They beat the fields harder, demanded confessions, shouted that curses had no power over them. Yet their bluster only betrayed their unease. For each lash struck, a new unease crept into their own bones, the sense that unseen hands guided every misfortune. Cups slipped from tables, doors refused to close, chickens refused to lay. The land itself seemed to grow restless. Among the enslaved, reactions split like cracks in stone. Some trembled, convinced that vengeance carried a cost they were not ready to bear. Others, watching overseers falter, felt a secret smile tug their lips in the dark. Silent prayers shifted from pleas for survival to murmurs of justice. No one dared speak openly, but the knowledge pulsed through the quarters like a hidden drumbeat. The old order was unraveling. Suspicion thickened in the big house. Keys were kept closer, whips used more freely, and torches burned late into the night. Yet the more they tried to tighten their grip, the more the shadows slipped through their fingers. Something unseen stalked the plantation, whether poison, curse, or fate itself. And it was only just beginning. Long before the overseer fell in the fields, before the whispers of curses and vanishing shadows, the seed of vengeance had been planted. The quiet figure at the center of it all carried wounds far older than the present fear. Years earlier, they had been part of a family once whole, small moments of laughter stolen at dusk, children who clung to their legs, a spouse whose strength made the nights bearable. That fragile world was broken with cruelty so deliberate it seemed designed to erase hope itself. The spouse was whipped to death in front of them, lashed until skin split and voice failed, all for daring to shield another slave from punishment. Blood soaked the earth, and though the body was buried in haste, the memory never faded. Soon after, the children were sold south, taken in wagons down roads lined with dust, their cries fading into distance until silence swallowed them whole. The figure left behind did not weep where overseers could see. They bent their head lower, worked harder, and let the silence wrap around them like a shroud. To the masters, they appeared broken. To themselves, they had become something else, patient. There had been an elder once, now long buried, who whispered lessons beneath the cover of night. Not just how to stretch meager food, how to bind wounds with leaves, how to read the stars. The elder spoke of something deeper, spirits who walked with the wronged, who listened when chains rattled and blood struck the soil. Spirits that did not forget, even when men tried to bury memory beneath cotton and coin. Silence is not surrender, the elder would murmur. It is the waiting of the river before the flood. Those words had lived on long after the elder's bones turned to dust. They became the quiet companion to every dawn bell, every whip crack, every night of gnawing hunger. The protagonist's silence was not cowardice. It was the sharpened stillness of someone who knew that vengeance did not need noise to make itself heard. Now, as overseers sickened and children screamed at shadows, that patience began to move. Grief had hardened into resolve. The lost spouse, the vanished children, the elder's voice, all braided together into a single truth. Justice could be written not in blood spilled openly, but in the absence of those who once held power. Fire and silence would be the ink, and the night was drawing near. The summer heat thickened into something oppressive, and with it came an outsider. He arrived on horseback one afternoon, a preacher draped in dusty black or perhaps a Confederate officer in faded gray. The stories differ, but all agree he carried warnings. Word had spread of uprisings in other counties. Barns burned, overseers cut down, families vanished into the woods. The war had loosened old chains, and fear rode in his shadow like a second rider. He sat stiff at the master's table, his voice sharp as he urged vigilance. "You've grown careless," he warned. "Discipline breeds order, and order must be kept. The slaves whisper more now. They hear the Union is near. If you do not tighten your hold, you will lose it altogether." The masters bristled at his tone. To them, the very idea that their slaves, silent, bowed, obedient, could rise against them was laughable. Still, suspicion rippled through the house. That evening, overseers stormed through the quarters, demanding confessions. They dragged men into the yard, accused women of witchcraft, threatened to whip children until truth spilled from their mouths. But there was no truth to seize, only silence. Every question was met with lowered eyes. Every blow absorbed into a stillness that gave nothing away. A mock trial was staged beneath the veranda, overseers circling like hounds. They hurled accusations of poison, of curses, of hidden plots, but without evidence, their fury collapsed into frustration. The outsider, unsettled by the stillness in the cabins and the strange quiet of the fields, took his leave. Whether preacher or soldier, he rode away muttering that the place felt touched by something unholy. Night fell heavy. In the big house, the masters drank deep, anger curdling into arrogance. They laughed at the outsider's warnings, mocked the notion of slaves clever enough to weave rebellion under their noses. They sang drunken songs while the veranda groaned beneath their weight, glasses clinking in false confidence. But beyond the glow of their lanterns, the quarters pulsed with a different kind of gathering. No voices were raised, no weapons displayed. Yet every glance, every breath seemed part of an invisible trial already underway. Judgment was not in the hands of overseers or masters now. It belonged to silence itself. And silence had already chosen its verdict. The air tightened like a noose. Something was waiting in the dark, and the night ahead promised to answer every laugh with absence. The night came cloaked in storm clouds, heavy and low, smothering the moon in a veil of darkness. The air carried a strange weight, as if the earth itself held its breath. Cicadas fell quiet, dogs whined in their kennels, and a thick silence stretched across the Tennessee fields. It was the silence of judgment, the moment long whispered about, now finally at hand. One by one, the masters were drawn from the safety of the big house. Some were lured by shouts in the fields, convinced thieves had come to raid their stores. Others followed the restless snorting of horses, or the sudden swing of barn doors left ajar. Drunken and arrogant, they carried lanterns and pistols, muttering curses into the night. But the darkness swallowed their words whole. The barn became the snare. Its doors closed with a groan like the settling of a coffin lid. Locks clicked, nails jammed, ropes tightened. Those who stepped inside found themselves trapped, their lanterns sputtering in the stale air. Others never made it past the yard, seized by shadows that moved with perfect silence. There were no screams, no thunder of struggle, only muffled gasps cut short, boots scraping against dirt, then nothing. The protagonist moved among them like a phantom, their silence sharper than any blade. Each act was swift, decisive, unseen. By the hour before dawn, 12 men, masters, overseers, kin, were gone. The plantation that had once roared with their voices lay quiet as a grave. The big house stood hollow, its windows black and unseeing, its veranda sagging beneath the absence of laughter and song. When morning came, the enslaved stepped cautiously from their quarters. No overseer's horn called them to the fields. No whip cracked the air. The barn smoldered, though no flame had touched its beams. Torn garments lay scattered near the fences, yet no bodies could be found. The earth bore no blood, only strange marks in the dirt, as though something had been dragged away into the shadows. "They are gone," whispered one voice, trembling in awe. Another answered, "Gone," and the word rippled through the cabins like a prayer. No chains rattled that morning. No commands were barked. Only silence remained, a silence that belonged not to obedience but to victory. The masters had vanished into the night, and the land itself seemed to breathe differently, as though at last it had been unshackled. By the following day, the plantation was a husk of itself. Panic spread through the big house first, wives clutching children, their eyes wide with terror as they realized the men were gone and no one could say how. Servants whispered of shadows, of voices cut short, but no one dared speak too loudly. Within hours, wagons were loaded with trunks and heirlooms, and the families fled down the muddy roads, leaving behind the echo of their fear. Neighbors arrived, drawn by rumor. They found the house abandoned, the barn scorched, the fields strangely still. No bodies greeted them, no signs of burial. Only scattered clothes, boots lying where footsteps had ended, and the smell of smoke clinging to the walls. They searched the grounds, tore up the soil, even dragged the nearby river, but nothing surfaced. It was as though the earth itself had opened its mouth and swallowed 12 men whole. For the enslaved, the night's silence became both freedom and burden. Some seized the moment without hesitation. Under cover of confusion, they slipped away into the forests, following the North Star toward Union lines. Others lingered, bound by age, fear, or memory. They spoke of the land itself being changed, of a curse laid heavy on the soil. "This place don't belong to no one no more," one old woman muttered, and many believed her. The plantation soon withered without hands to command it. Cotton rotted in the fields, untended, and weeds rose where order once held sway. The veranda sagged deeper into decay, shutters banging in the wind like hollow warnings. By the next season, no one dared to live there. Locals passing on the road averted their eyes, crossing themselves or muttering prayers. Some claimed the slaves had conjured spirits from across the sea. Others swore they had seen a figure, silent and watchful, standing at the edge of the fields even after the quarters were empty. No graves were ever marked, no bones ever found. The plantation rotted into ruin, its silence becoming its own kind of story, one carried from farm to farm, whispered in fear and retold as warning. What had once been a symbol of wealth and dominion now stood only as a scar, where absence itself ruled the land. Decades passed, but the story of the Tennessee plantation never faded. By the turn of the century, the land had already been abandoned to weeds and ruin, yet travelers still whispered of it when night fell. They called it cursed ground, a place where the air pressed heavy on the chest and the silence never lifted. Hunters said their dogs would balk at the edge of the property, whining and refusing to cross the withered fields. No matter how hard the leash was pulled, the animals dug in their paws, ears flat, eyes wide at something unseen. Some hunters swore they heard the low rattle of chains drifting across the night air, though no soul lived within a mile of the old house. Children in nearby towns dared one another to creep into the quarters. The cabins, now collapsed into skeletons of wood and stone, still smelled faintly of smoke. Boards groaned as if something shifted beneath them, and more than one boy ran out screaming that he felt eyes watching from the shadows. The bravest told of shapes glimpsed in the corner of their vision, tall, silent figures that vanished when stared at directly. Folklore spread like ivy. Old women claimed that on the thickest summer nights, when the air itself seemed to sweat, 12 shadows could be seen moving in the fields. They walked without sound, without breath, their outlines blurred like smoke. Some said they were the masters, searching for the voices stolen from them in a single night. Others swore they were not men at all, but the memory of vengeance itself, destined to wander until time ended. One tale, told again and again, spoke of a discovery during a storm. A traveler seeking shelter pulled free a charred beam from the ruins of the barn. Burnt nearly black, it bore 12 tally marks carved deep into the wood. No one could say who had made them or when. Some insisted the marks had not been there before, that they were carved not by hand but by the fire itself, etching a record that could not be erased. The beam was later lost, though some swear it still surfaces in secret, passed from hand to trembling hand as proof of the curse. And so the legend remains, older than memory but sharp as a blade. They thought silence meant obedience, but silence, once awakened, can erase even the loudest of masters. Stories like these are more than just tales of the past. They are echoes, echoes of our ancestors' pain, their silence, their unbroken strength. Do you feel it too? That weight in the chest when you imagine their footsteps in the dark. If their resilience moves you, if their silence still speaks to you across centuries, then honor them by keeping these stories alive. Subscribe to this channel and stand with us in remembering what was never meant to be forgotten.